The manila envelope hit the marble reception desk with a sound that shattered Elena Morrison's world. But the man standing before her, her husband of 12 years, didn't flinch as he slid the divorce papers toward her with the cold precision of a corporate executioner. Robert Morrison, senior project manager at Sterling Heights Development Corporation, straightened his tie with the same hands that once promised forever. But now those hands belonged to someone else, his secretary, the woman whose laughter echoed from his office every night he claimed to be working late. Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the papers, but what Robert didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom as he ordered security to escort his wife from the building, was that the gleaming $8.9 billion skyscraper empire towering around them, every steel beam and glass panel of Sterling Heights Development Corporation, belonged to her. She had inherited the company through a blind trust established by her late father 6 months ago, but she had kept it secret, waiting for the right moment to step into her role, never imagining that moment would arrive like this. Robert's lips curled into a smile as he watched her being led away, but that smile would soon crumble when the anonymous owner he'd been desperate to impress revealed herself as the woman he'd just betrayed. His mistress, Jessica, already planning her new life as Mrs. Morrison, had no idea the empire she thought she was marrying into was about to collapse beneath her designer heels. But Elena did, and what she was about to unleash would redefine everything they thought they knew about power, revenge, and the cost of underestimating the quiet woman they'd dismissed as worthless. Would Robert realize his catastrophic mistake before the board meeting that would seal his fate? But would it matter when Elena had already set into motion a series of decisions that would strip him of everything? His job, his reputation, his future? Would Jessica's ambition survive the moment she discovered she'd destroyed her own career for a man who now had nothing to offer? But would she fight back or flee when the truth emerged? Would Elena find satisfaction in her revenge? But would the cost of crushing those who betrayed her leave her as empty as the marriage she was about to dissolve? The March rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Heights Development Corporation's lobby, but Elena Morrison barely noticed the weather as she stepped through the revolving doors, her heels clicking against imported Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. She'd come to bring Robert his forgotten lunch, homemade chicken parmesan, his favorite, but the brown paper bag felt heavier with each step, weighted down by a marriage that had been dying for months, though she'd refused to see it. The receptionist, a young woman named Bethany who'd always been kind, looked up with an expression Elena would later remember as pity, but at the moment she mistook it for concern. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't think—" Robert emerged from the elevator bank before Bethany could finish, but he wasn't alone. Jessica Chen walked beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her blonde highlights catching the lobby's chandelier light in a way that seemed deliberately theatrical. But Robert's face told a different story. This wasn't an affair anymore. This was a declaration. Elena. Her name came out flat, emotionless, but there was something worse underneath. Inconvenience. She'd become an inconvenience to him. "I brought your lunch," she said, hating how small her voice sounded in the cavernous lobby, but Robert's eyes barely registered the bag. "We need to talk," he said, but before she could respond, he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, manila, legal-sized, official. The envelope hit the reception desk between them, but Elena couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what was happening, even though some part of her had known this moment was inevitable. Robert slid the papers toward her with clinical efficiency, the same way he probably reviewed construction contracts, but this contract was dissolving their life together. "Divorce papers," he said, as if she couldn't read the bold letters stamped across the top. "My attorney says it should be straightforward since we kept our finances separate, but you'll need to sign by Friday." Jessica's perfume Something expensive and cloying filled Elena's nostrils as the secretary stepped closer, but the woman had the decency to look away, her guilt apparently having limits, though not enough to stop her from destroying someone else's marriage. "Robert, please." Elena's hand reached for his arm, but he stepped back as if her touch burned, and that small movement hurt more than the papers, more than Jessica's presence, more than anything that had come before. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Robert said, but his jaw was set, his decision made. "Jessica and I are getting married as soon as the divorce is final, but we wanted to tell you in person rather than let you hear it from someone else." How generous, Elena thought, but she couldn't find her voice to say it. "I think it's best if you leave now," Robert continued, and suddenly his hand was up, gesturing to security. "Marcus, please escort Mrs. Morrison from the building, but make sure she takes all her personal items. She won't need to come back." The security guard, a man Elena had chatted with dozens of times, who knew how she took her coffee, who'd helped her carry packages during the holidays, approached with obvious reluctance, but his job demanded compliance, and Elena was being treated like an intruder in a building her husband had worked in for 8 years. "Sir, is that really necessary?" Marcus asked, but Robert's glare answered before his words did. "Company policy," Robert said. "Non-employees need an escort, but Mrs. Morrison is no longer affiliated with anyone who works here." The humiliation burned through Elena like acid, but she forced herself to stand straight, to hold her head up even as tears blurred her vision. She left the lunch bag on the desk, let him starve, let Jessica discover he preferred his pasta with extra oregano, let them figure out all the small things she'd done for 12 years, while he'd been building his career on her support. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," Marcus whispered as he walked her toward the doors, but Elena couldn't respond, couldn't do anything except put one foot in front of the other while Robert and Jessica watched from beside the security desk. The rain soaked through her coat within seconds of stepping outside, but Elena welcomed it, let it mix with her tears until she couldn't tell which was which. She stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the massive tower that stretched 73 floors into the Seattle sky, but her mind was spinning backward, searching for the moment everything went wrong. 6 months earlier, September, the attorney's office had smelled like old books and lemon polish, but Elena had barely noticed the decor as James Rothstein, her father's lawyer for 30 years, explained the terms of the trust that would change her life. "Your father wanted you to have time," Rothstein said, sliding documents across his mahogany desk. "The blind trust has been managing Sterling Heights Development Corporation since his death, but now that the probate is complete, you're the sole owner. But he stipulated that you could reveal yourself whenever you felt ready." Elena had stared at the papers, at her father's signature, at the corporate structure that detailed an $8.9 billion empire built on commercial real estate, residential developments, and international holdings that spanned 14 countries, but none of it felt real. "I don't know anything about running a company," she'd said, but Rothstein had smiled with something that looked like anticipation. "That's why your father assembled the best board in the industry," he'd explained. "They've been running operations smoothly, but they're waiting for you to step in when you're ready. Until then, they believe they're reporting to an anonymous trust, but the truth is, you've been the owner for 6 months." Elena had thought about Robert then, about how excited he'd be, but something stopped her from sharing the news. Maybe it was the way he'd been distant lately, the way he worked later and later, the way he'd stopped asking about her day, but she'd decided to wait, to surprise him when she felt confident enough to step into her father's legacy. That surprise was about to become Robert's nightmare, but in September, she'd still believed their marriage was worth saving. Present day, March, the day after the divorce papers, Elena's childhood friend, Margaret Wu, set a cup of tea on the coffee table with the careful precision of someone handling explosives, but her eyes were filled with the kind of fury that came from watching someone you loved get destroyed. Tell me you're going to destroy him, Margaret said, sitting beside Elena on the couch in the apartment that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too full of memories that now tasted like poison. Tell me you're not going to let him walk away from this, but more importantly, tell me you're finally going to claim what's yours. Elena wrapped her hands around the mug, but the warmth couldn't touch the ice that had formed in her chest. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't think straight right now. Then let me think for you, Margaret said. You own the company he works for, but he just humiliated you in front of everyone, had you escorted out like a criminal, served you divorce papers while his mistress watched. Do you know what the board would do if they knew their senior project manager was behaving like this? The board. Elena hadn't thought about them since receiving the papers, but suddenly the pieces began falling into place with crystalline clarity. The quarterly meeting was scheduled for next week, her first official appearance as owner, though the board didn't know that yet, but they'd been expecting the mysterious trust owner to finally reveal themselves. The meeting is Tuesday, Elena said slowly, but her mind was already racing ahead, calculating moves and counter-moves like the chess player her father had trained her to be. What are you thinking? Margaret asked, but she was leaning forward now, recognizing the shift in her friend's demeanor. I'm thinking that Robert has been trying to impress the owner for months, Elena said, and now her voice was steadier. He's been submitting proposals, angling for a promotion to vice president of development, but he has no idea he's been trying to impress his own wife. His soon-to-be ex-wife, Margaret corrected, but there was satisfaction in her tone. The divorce isn't final for 6 months, Elena said, and something cold and sharp was forming in her chest. Not quite revenge, not quite justice, but something in between that tasted like survival. 6 months where I'm legally entitled to make decisions, but 6 months where I'm also still his wife on paper. Margaret's smile was predatory. What are you going to do? Elena stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city, but her eyes found Sterling Heights Tower in the distance, its lights blazing against the darkening sky. I'm going to attend that board meeting, but first, I'm going to do some research on Robert's projects, his conduct, his performance. If he wants a divorce, fine, but he's going to sign those papers as an unemployed man. And Jessica? Jessica is about to learn that sleeping with your boss only works if your boss has job security, Elena said, but there was no satisfaction in the words yet, only determination. She's been his secretary for 3 years, which means she's been privy to confidential information, personal details about board members, strategic plans. If she's been sharing any of that with Robert outside appropriate channels, but especially if she's been using it for personal gain, that's a termination offense. Margaret stood beside her friend, but she placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. Are you sure about this? Because once you start, but there's no going back. Elena thought about the lunch bag left on the reception desk, about Marcus's apologetic face, about Jessica's hand on Robert's arm, about the casual cruelty of being escorted from the building like a stranger, but most of all, she thought about 12 years of supporting Robert's career, while her own dreams sat in a box labeled someday. I've never been more sure of anything, Elena said, but she was already pulling out her phone, already dialing James Rothstein's number. It's time everyone learned who really owns Sterling Heights. 1 week later, the board meeting. The Sterling Heights Development Corporation boardroom occupied the entire 73rd floor, but the panoramic views of Seattle's skyline were wasted on the 12 people gathered around the black granite conference table. They'd been waiting 30 minutes for the mysterious trust owner to arrive, but the anxiety in the room was palpable. Their quarterly reports spread before them like shields. Robert sat in the gallery section, invited as a potential VP candidate to observe the meeting, but he'd spent the last week rehearsing his presentation, perfecting his pitch, imagining the moment he'd finally meet the owner who could make or break his career. Jessica had helped him practice every night, her enthusiasm making up for the nagging guilt that occasionally surfaced when he thought about Elena signing the divorce papers. He'd sent them to her apartment via courier, but she'd signed them immediately. No arguments, no drama, and the ease of it should have relieved him. Instead, it felt anticlimactic, like she'd given up too easily. But Robert pushed the thought away, focusing on his future with Jessica, on the promotion he could taste. The boardroom doors opened, but everyone stood automatically, expecting the owner, though no one knew what to expect. James Rothstein entered first, his expression neutral, but he held the door open as someone else stepped through. Elena Morrison walked into the boardroom wearing a charcoal gray suit that her father had once told her meant business, but her hair was pulled back, her makeup minimal, her entire demeanor radiating the kind of quiet authority that didn't need theatrics. She moved to the head of the table, but her eyes swept the room, cataloging reactions, measuring surprise, landing finally on Robert. The color drained from his face so completely that for a moment she thought he might faint. But he gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Good afternoon," Elena said, but her voice carried through the room with unexpected strength. "I'm Elena Morrison, sole owner of Sterling Heights Development Corporation, but I apologize for the secrecy. My father believed I should take time to understand the company before revealing myself, and after 6 months of observation, I'm ready to step into my role." Board members exchanged glances, some confused, some calculating, but Catherine Walsh, the CFO who'd worked with Elena's father for 20 years, smiled with what looked like pride. "Elena," Catherine said, standing, "your father would be proud, but we're honored to finally meet you officially. We've been managing operations according to his wishes, but we're ready to follow your leadership." "Thank you, Catherine," Elena said, but she remained standing, her hands resting on the back of the leather chair at the table's head. "Before we begin the quarterly review, however, I need to address a personnel matter that's come to my attention, but it requires immediate action." Robert's face had gone from white to green, but he seemed frozen in his seat, unable to speak, unable to move, though his mind was clearly racing through implications, connections, the catastrophic scope of his mistake. "As many of you know," Elena continued, but she looked directly at Robert now, "I recently filed for divorce from my husband, Robert Morrison, but what you may not know is that Mr. Morrison is currently employed as a senior project manager in this company. Yesterday, I completed a comprehensive review of his projects, his conduct, and his compliance with company policies." Catherine's expression shifted from welcoming to professional, but the other board members leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "The review revealed several concerning issues," Elena said, but she was pulling documents from a folder Rothstein handed her. "First, Mr. Morrison has been in a romantic relationship with his secretary, Jessica Chen, for approximately 18 months, but this relationship was never disclosed to HR as required by company policy regarding workplace relationships." Robert found his voice finally, but it came out strangled. "Elena, please." "Second," Elena continued, ignoring him, "Ms. Chen has been forwarding confidential emails regarding board decisions, competitor analysis, and strategic planning to Mr. Morrison's personal email account. But this information was then used by Mr. Morrison to craft proposals that gave him an unfair advantage over other project managers." "That's not," Robert started, but Catherine's sharp voice cut him off. "Is this true?" The CFO's fury was directed at Robert now, but her professional reputation was built on integrity, and corporate espionage disguised as office romance violated everything she stood for. "Jessica was helping me prepare for the VP position," Robert said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. "You thought you could use insider information to advance your career," Elena said, but there was no emotion in her voice, just facts, cold and precise. Third, the Riverside development project that you've been citing as your greatest success actually exceeded budget by 30%. But you failed to disclose this to the Oversight Committee, instead hiding the overruns in other project accounts. Robert stood now, but his legs were shaking. Elena, you can't do this, but you're doing this because I'm divorcing you. This is revenge, but it's unprofessional. This is business, Elena said, and now ice crept into her tone. You made it personal when you had me escorted from this building like a criminal, but now I'm making it professional. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, but security will escort you from the premises. Ms. Chen's employment has also been terminated as of this morning. The room fell silent except for the rain beginning to tap against the windows, but Robert looked like he'd been punched, his career disintegrating before his eyes, his future crumbling into dust. You can't do this, he said again, but it was a plea now, not an argument. Jessica and we're getting married, but I need this job. I need the income. Perhaps you should have considered that before serving divorce papers to the woman who owned your company, Elena said, but she sat down now, signaling the end of his relevance. Security is waiting outside, but I believe you know the way out. Robert stumbled toward the doors, but he stopped, turning back with desperation etched across his face. Elena, please, but we were married for 12 years. Don't do this, but give me another chance. You made your choice when you chose Jessica, Elena said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Now live with it, but don't ask me to save you from the consequences. The doors closed behind him with a finality that echoed through the boardroom, but Elena didn't watch him leave. She had a company to run, a legacy to honor, and a future to build. But first, she had to show the board that she was worthy of her father's faith. That evening, Jessica's apartment. Jessica Chen's apartment, paid for partly by Robert's previous bonuses, felt smaller than usual as Robert paced the living room, but his phone had been ringing constantly with messages from former colleagues, from friends, from his mother who'd heard the news through the professional grapevine that moved faster than wildfire. How could you not know? Jessica demanded, but her own phone was dark, her job gone, her professional reputation destroyed by association. How could you not know Elena was the owner? She never told me, Robert said, but he was running his hands through his hair, leaving it standing in wild tufts. Her father died, but she said there was a trust, some inheritance. She never said. He stopped, memory flooding back. She tried to tell me something 6 months ago, but I was busy with the Henderson project. I told her we'd talk later. You told her to wait, Jessica said flatly, but realization was dawning across her face. She tried to share something important, but you were too busy, and she decided to wait, and then you served her divorce papers while she held the power to destroy you. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so catastrophic, but Robert collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. I have 3 months severance, but that's it. The VP position is gone, but no other company in the industry will hire me, not with this on my record. Elena made sure everyone knows why I was fired. Jessica sat beside him, but the proximity felt wrong now. The romance that had seemed so exciting just weeks ago, now tainted by unemployment and scandal. My entire career is ruined, she said. I can't get another secretary position, not after being fired for sharing confidential information, but I have student loans, rent, credit cards. We'll figure it out, Robert said, but even he didn't believe it. Will we? Jessica turned to face him, but her expression was calculating now, no longer adoring. Because the only reason I was attracted to you was your position, your prospects. But now you have nothing. You're just a divorced, unemployed man who betrayed his wife for someone who can't even support herself. The words landed like physical blows, but Robert couldn't argue with them. I thought you loved me, he said weakly. I loved your future, Jessica said, standing. But that future died today, and I'm not going to drown with you. She walked to the bedroom, but Robert could hear drawers opening, clothes being packed. She was leaving. Of course, she was leaving, but the speed of her abandonment shouldn't have surprised him. He'd chosen ambition over loyalty, but Jessica had done the same, and now they were both paying the price. 20 minutes later, Jessica emerged with 2 suitcases, but she didn't look at Robert as she headed for the door. "You can stay until the end of the month, but then you need to find somewhere else. I'm moving back to Portland, but I'm going to try to rebuild my career somewhere Elena's reputation doesn't reach." The door closed behind her, but Robert remained on the couch, surrounded by the wreckage of choices that had seemed so right just a week ago. His phone buzzed again. Another message, probably another friend or colleague offering hollow condolences or secret satisfaction, but he couldn't bear to look. Elena had destroyed him methodically, professionally, completely, but the worst part was knowing he'd given her the tools to do it. Every policy violation, every hidden budget overrun, every confidential email Jessica had forwarded. These weren't inventions or exaggerations, but truths he'd ignored because they served his ambition. The rain hammered against the windows like judgment, but Robert had nowhere to go, no one to blame but himself. And the taste of that realization was more bitter than any revenge Elena could have crafted. Sterling Heights Development Corporation's summer gala was traditionally held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, but this year felt different, charged with an energy that came from leadership change, from scandal survived, from a future that looked brighter than anyone had expected. Elena stood near the bar, watching her employees celebrate, but Catherine Walsh approached with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile that had become familiar over the past months. "To your father," Catherine said, handing Elena a glass, "but more importantly, to you. You've exceeded every expectation, but I think he knew you would." They clinked glasses, but Elena's eyes swept the ballroom, taking in faces that had become familiar, projects that were thriving under her leadership, a company that had grown by 15% in the 3 months since she'd taken over. "Any regrets?" Catherine asked quietly, but her expression was knowing. Elena thought about Robert, about the last she'd heard through Margaret's updates. He'd taken a project manager position with a small firm in Spokane, but the pay was half what he'd made at Sterling Heights. His prospects limited, his reputation permanently tarnished. Jessica had moved to Portland as promised, but found only temp work, her career in corporate real estate effectively over. "No regrets," Elena said finally, but it was true. They made choices, but those choices had consequences. I didn't destroy them, they destroyed themselves, but I simply stopped protecting them from the results. "Your father used to say that the measure of a leader isn't how they treat success," Catherine said, "but how they handle betrayal. He'd be proud of how you handled yours, but more importantly, how you turned it into strength." Margaret appeared then, weaving through the crowd with her husband, David, but her smile was radiant. "There's the woman of the hour, but we have news. David got the promotion, which means we can finally afford that house we've been looking at." Elena embraced her friend, genuinely happy, but grateful for the loyalty that had sustained her through the darkest weeks. "That's wonderful, but you'll have to let me help with the housewarming." "Only if you promise to stop working 18-hour days," Margaret said, but her concern was real beneath the teasing. "You've proven yourself, but now you need to live a little." As if on cue, Thomas Drake, the head of Drake International Architecture, approached their group, but his attention was focused entirely on Elena. They'd been working together on the new waterfront development, but lately their meetings had extended beyond business, their conversations drifting toward personal territory that felt both dangerous and exhilarating. "Ms. Morrison," Thomas said, but his smile suggested he was about to break protocol. "I was hoping you'd save a dance for me, but I understand if the owner of the company has more important obligations." Catherine and Margaret exchanged meaningful looks, but they melted away into the crowd, leaving Elena alone with Thomas's outstretched hand. "Just one dance," Elena said, but she was smiling as she took his hand, letting him lead her to the dance floor where other couples swayed to music that felt like possibility. "I have a confession," Thomas said as they began to move. "I knew who you were before the board meeting, but your father and I discussed architecture together for years, and he showed me pictures, told me stories. I should have said something sooner, but I wanted to see how you'd handle the transition." Elena looked up at him, but instead of anger, she felt curiosity. "And your verdict?" "You're better than he was," Thomas said simply. "But don't tell his ghost I said that. You have his strategic mind, but you have something he struggled with, the ability to forgive yourself for being human." The words struck deeper than Elena expected, but she realized he was right. Her father had been brilliant, but he'd been hard on himself, driven by perfection, unable to acknowledge weakness. She'd spent 3 months trying to emulate him, but maybe the better path was to honor him while becoming someone different, someone who could be strong without being invulnerable. "What if I told you I'm terrified most days?" Elena said, but the honesty surprised her. "What if I told you that I wake up wondering if today's the day I'll make a mistake that costs people their jobs, but that the weight of this responsibility sometimes feels crushing?" "Then I'd say you're exactly the right person for this role," Thomas said. "But more importantly, I'd say you're human, and that's not a weakness. That's why people are loyal to you, but it's why your company is thriving. You lead with empathy, but you balance it with strength, and that's rare." The song ended, but they remained on the dance floor, the moment suspended between them like a question waiting to be asked. "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" Thomas asked finally, but his vulnerability matched hers. Not as business associates, but as two people who might enjoy getting to know each other without contracts and blueprints between them. Elena thought about Robert, about how she'd lost herself in supporting his dreams, but she also thought about the woman she'd become in the past 3 months, stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. "I'd like that," she said, "but only if you promise not to treat me like I'm made of glass. I've had enough of being handled carefully, but I'm ready for someone who can match my strength." Thomas's smile was genuine, but his respect was evident. "I think I can manage that, but fair warning, I'm competitive, opinionated, and I will absolutely argue with you if I think you're wrong about architecture." "Perfect," Elena said, but she was laughing now, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'll see you next week then, but bring your best arguments. I've been studying architecture in my spare time." As the evening continued, Elena found herself surrounded by employees who respected her, board members who trusted her, friends who loved her, but most importantly, she found herself comfortable in her own skin, confident in her decisions, certain of her path forward. Robert's betrayal had felt like the end of everything, but it had actually been a beginning, the catalyst that forced her to claim the power she'd been afraid to embrace, but also the wake-up call that showed her she'd been living half a life, supporting someone else's dreams while her own withered from neglect. The divorce had been finalized the week before, but Elena had signed the papers without hesitation, without regret, understanding finally that some endings were necessary for new chapters to begin. The photograph in Forbes magazine showed Elena standing in front of Sterling Heights Tower, but the headline read, "How Elena Morrison Turned Personal Betrayal into a $12,000 billion empire." The article detailed her expansion into sustainable development, her innovative approach to affordable housing, her reputation as one of the industry's most ethical and effective leaders, but it also mentioned, briefly, the dramatic circumstances of her first board meeting. Thomas had framed the article and hung it in their shared office. They'd merged their companies 6 months ago, combining Sterling Heights Development with Drake International Architecture to create an industry powerhouse. But their personal merger had happened even faster, their connection built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of partnership Elena had never experienced with Robert. Margaret visited the new office on a sunny June afternoon, but her daughter, 3-month-old Grace, was sleeping in a carrier against her chest. "Have you heard?" she asked Elena, but her tone suggested gossip worth sharing. "Heard what?" Elena looked up. From the sustainability report she'd been reviewing, but she was grateful for the interruption. "Robert got married," Margaret said, "but not to Jessica, to some woman he met at his new job. Apparently, she doesn't know about his past, but I give it 6 months before she realizes what she's gotten herself into." Elena felt nothing, no satisfaction, no anger, no curiosity, but just a mild acknowledgement of information that no longer mattered. "I hope he's learned something," she said finally, "but I suspect he hasn't. Some people never do." "And you?" Margaret asked, but she was smiling. "Any regrets about how everything turned out?" Elena looked around the office that represented everything she'd built, but then her eyes found Thomas through the glass wall, watching him sketch designs while arguing good-naturedly with one of their architects. She thought about the affordable housing project they'd completed in her father's name, about the sustainability awards their company had won, about the scholarship fund she'd established for architecture students from underprivileged backgrounds. But most of all, she thought about the woman she'd become, someone who'd taken betrayal and transformed it into purpose. "No regrets," Elena said, but she meant it completely. "Robert did me a favor when he served those divorce papers, but he was too blind to see it. He thought he was leaving me with nothing, but he actually freed me to become everything I was meant to be." Thomas appeared in the doorway, but he was holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that made Elena's heart lift. "Board meeting in 20 minutes, but Catherine wants to present the quarterly numbers herself. Apparently we've exceeded projections again." "Of course we have," Elena said, standing, accepting the coffee. "We have the best team in the industry, but more importantly, we have a culture built on integrity, not ambition." As she walked toward the conference room, Margaret called after her, "Your father would be proud, but you know that, right?" Elena turned back, but she was smiling. "I do, but more importantly, I'm proud of myself, and that's something I could never have said a year ago." The Sterling Heights board meeting began exactly on time, but the atmosphere was celebratory, the numbers reflecting a company thriving under leadership that valued people over profit, quality over shortcuts, and integrity over expedience. Elena listened to Catherine's presentation, but her mind wandered briefly to Robert, to Jessica, to the version of herself who'd stood in this very room a year ago, destroyed but not defeated, betrayed but not broken. That woman had made choices that changed everything, but those choices had required courage she didn't know she possessed until betrayal forced her to find it. She'd crushed Robert's career and left him jobless, not out of cruelty but out of justice. He'd violated policies, abused trust, used insider information for personal gain. But most importantly, he'd underestimated the quiet woman he'd dismissed as worthless. Jessica had paid the price for her own choices, but she'd gambled on ambition and lost when her shortcut proved to be a dead end. They'd both learned an expensive lesson about the cost of betrayal, but Elena suspected they'd learned nothing about the value of integrity. And that was their tragedy, not hers. The meeting concluded with applause, but Thomas caught Elena's hand as everyone filed out. "Dinner tonight?" he asked, but his eyes were warm with the kind of love that respected rather than diminished, that supported without smothering, that celebrated her strength instead of fearing it. "Dinner sounds perfect," Elena said, "but first I need to review the plans for the Sacramento project, sign off on the new hires, and return calls to 3 different investors." "So dinner at 9? Thomas said, but he was laughing. 9:30, Elena corrected, "but I promise I'm worth the wait." As she returned to her office, Elena caught her reflection in the window. The city spread below her, Sterling Heights Tower standing proud among the skyline. The company her father built now exceeding even his ambitious vision. but all of it secondary to the woman she saw looking back. Confident, powerful, respected, but most importantly, free. Robert had kicked her out after serving divorce papers to marry his secretary, but in doing so, he'd freed her from a marriage that was suffocating her potential. He'd thought he was discarding someone worthless, but he'd actually released someone powerful, who no longer needed to dim her light to avoid overshadowing his fragile ego. What she'd done had crushed his mistress and left him jobless, but it had also taught her that power without compassion was empty, that revenge without justice was hollow, but that standing up for yourself and demanding respect was the only way to build a life worth living. The sun set over Seattle, but Elena Morrison didn't watch it disappear. She had work to do, a company to lead, a partner who respected her, friends who loved her, and a future limited only by her own imagination. But most importantly, she had herself, whole, healed, and unafraid of whatever came next. Some stories ended with revenge, but Elena's story ended with something better. Victory, not over Robert or Jessica, but over the version of herself who'd accepted less than she deserved. That victory was worth more than any empire, but fortunately, she had both, and she'd earned every bit of it through courage, integrity, and the refusal to let betrayal define her. The lights of Sterling Heights Tower blazed against the darkening sky like a beacon, but Elena smiled, turned away from the window, and got back to work. She had a legacy to honor, but more importantly, she had a future to build. And nothing, not betrayal, not divorce, not the doubts that occasionally surfaced, would stop her from becoming exactly who she was meant to be. Unaware no longer, but unstoppable forever. The autumn leaves scattered across the courtyard of Sullivan Drake Innovation Center, but Elena Morrison Drake stood at the dedication ceremony with her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly, 7 months pregnant with the daughter who would be named Catherine Grace, honoring both the CFO who'd stood by her and the friend who'd never wavered. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her waist, but his eyes were focused on the building that represented everything they'd built together, both professionally and personally. "Your father would have loved this," Catherine Walsh said, approaching with tears in her eyes. But her retirement had been announced last month, effective after 25 years of service. A research center dedicated to sustainable architecture and affordable housing innovation, but funded entirely by profits from ethical business practices. Gregory always said that wealth without purpose was just numbers on a page. Elena embraced her mentor carefully, mindful of her belly, but grateful for the woman who'd guided her through those early uncertain months. "You taught me that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about being wise enough to listen to those who are. This center exists because you showed me how to balance profit with principle." The crowd gathered for the dedication included employees from Sterling Drake Development. The merged company now employed over 3,000 people across 12 cities, but also architecture students, affordable housing advocates, environmental activists, and journalists covering what the New York Times had called the most significant philanthropic venture in modern real estate history. Margaret Wu Chen pushed through the crowd with her 2 children, Grace, now 5, and her brother Marcus, 3, but her smile was radiant as she reached Elena. "Remember when you were sitting in that cafe, holding divorce papers and thinking your life was over?" she said, but her voice was low enough that only Elena could hear. "Look at you now." Elena did look, at the building bearing her parents' names combined with Thomas's, at the employees who respected rather than feared her, at the husband who'd proposed not with diamonds, but with blueprints for a home they'd designed together, at the foundation she'd established that had housed over 15,000 families in affordable, sustainable developments. But most of all, she looked at the woman she'd become when survival demanded evolution. "I almost didn't fight back," Elena admitted, something she'd never told anyone except Thomas. That morning, after Robert served the papers, I almost just signed them and walked away, accepted that I'd failed at marriage and therefore failed at life. But something in me, maybe my father's voice, maybe my mother's memory, maybe just rage, refused to let him win by default. "Well, thank God for rage," Margaret said, but she was hugging Elena now, carefully. Because the woman who almost walked away wouldn't have created this, wouldn't have helped thousands of families, wouldn't have shown an entire industry that ethical leadership isn't weakness. The ceremony began, but Elena's speech was brief, powerful, focused not on her own journey but on the mission ahead: sustainability, accessibility, innovation balanced with humanity. She spoke about her father's vision, her mother's compassion, but she also spoke about failure, about betrayal, about the moments that test character and reveal whether suffering makes us bitter or better. 5 years ago, I learned that sometimes our greatest gifts come wrapped in our worst nightmares, Elena said, her voice carrying across the courtyard through microphones that Thomas's team had positioned perfectly. I learned that being underestimated is an advantage, that being dismissed gives you freedom, but most importantly, I learned that you don't know what you're capable of until circumstances demand more than you think you can give. The applause was thunderous, but Elena's eyes found Thomas, found the pride and love in his expression, and she remembered their wedding 2 years ago. Small, intimate, focused on commitment rather than spectacle, but surrounded by people who genuinely cared rather than guests performing obligation. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed toward the reception, a figure approached that Elena recognized but hadn't seen in years. But Jessica Chen looked different now, older, harder, but also somehow smaller than Elena remembered. "Mrs. Morrison Drake," Jessica said, but her voice was hesitant, uncertain. "I know I have no right to speak to you, but I needed to apologize for what I did 5 years ago." Elena studied the woman who'd helped destroy her first marriage, but she felt no anger, no vindication, just a distant curiosity about what circumstances brought her here. "What happened to you?" she asked, but the question was genuine, not cruel. "Everything fell apart," Jessica said simply. "After I moved to Portland, I couldn't find decent work. My student loans went into default. I moved back in with my parents at 32. I spent 3 years blaming you, but then I realized you didn't ruin my life. I ruined it by thinking success was something you could steal from someone else rather than build yourself." "And now?" Elena asked, but she was aware of Thomas watching protectively from a few feet away, ready to intervene if needed. "Now I'm a property manager for a small apartment complex," Jessica said, "but it's honest work and I'm good at it. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that what happened taught me something I apparently needed to learn the hard way, that shortcuts always cost more than the long road, but by the time you realize it, you've already paid the price." Elena considered the woman before her, but she thought about grace, about mercy, about the difference between justice and cruelty. "I forgive you," she said finally, "but not because you deserve it, and not because what you did wasn't wrong. I forgive you because carrying anger is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy than hate someone who can't hurt me anymore." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, understanding that forgiveness didn't mean friendship, didn't mean forgetting, just meant releasing the weight of bitterness. "Thank you," she whispered, but I should go. Congratulations on everything you've built. You deserve all of it." As Jessica walked away, Thomas appeared at Elena's side, but his hand found hers instinctively. "That was generous," he said, "but are you okay?" "I'm perfect," Elena said, and she meant it, but she realized forgiveness had freed something in her she hadn't known was still trapped. "She's not my enemy anymore. She's just someone who made terrible choices and has to live with them, but that's not my burden to carry." Margaret rejoined them, but she'd witnessed the exchange from a distance. "So what happened to Robert?" she asked. "But I know you've kept tabs through Catherine, even if you pretend you don't care." Elena smiled, but she didn't deny it. Curiosity wasn't the same as obsession, and knowing your past didn't mean dwelling in it. He's still in Spokane, still in middle management, still married to the woman who apparently has no idea about his history. Catherine says his performance reviews are adequate but uninspired. He does his job but never excels, takes no risks, proposes no innovations, but he collects his paycheck and goes home. "Sad," Margaret said, but she didn't sound sympathetic. He had everything and threw it away for what he thought was an upgrade, but he ended up with less than he started with. "He ended up with exactly what he deserved," Elena corrected. "But more accurately, he ended up with the life his choices created. We all do." The reception moved inside the Innovation Center, but the building's interior showcased the future of sustainable design. Solar integration, water reclamation, modular construction techniques that reduced waste by 70%, but all of it beautiful, proving that environmental responsibility didn't require aesthetic sacrifice. Thomas gave a tour to a group of architecture students, but Elena watched him with the kind of love that had grown from partnership rather than passion, from respect rather than romance, though they'd found plenty of both. He caught her watching and winked, but his attention returned to the students who represented the industry's future. Catherine approached with a glass of sparkling water for Elena, but her expression was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something your father said shortly before he died," she said, "but I never understood it until today. He told me, 'Catherine, I'm not worried about Sterling Heights. The company will survive or fail based on market forces and human decisions, but I'm worried about Elena. She's so good at caring for others that she's forgotten how to fight for herself.' But then he smiled and said, 'But when she remembers, when circumstances force her to choose between surviving and surrendering, she'll be unstoppable, and God help anyone who underestimates her.'" Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "He knew Robert would betray me. He suspected Robert was too ambitious to love anyone more than himself," Catherine said. "But he also knew you were too loyal to leave without cause. So he built you a safety net, gave you power you didn't know you possessed, but trusted that when you needed it, you'd claim it and use it wisely." "Did I?" Elena asked, but she genuinely wanted Catherine's assessment. "Use it wisely." Catherine looked around the Innovation Center, at the employees mingling, at the students learning, at the journalists documenting a story about business done differently, but then her eyes returned to Elena. "You fired Robert for cause, not revenge. He violated policies and damaged the company, but you acted with integrity. You forgave Jessica when it served no purpose except freeing yourself from bitterness. You've grown this company by 300% while improving working conditions, environmental impact, and community engagement. But most importantly, you've proven that strength without compassion is tyranny, but compassion without strength is weakness. You've found the balance your father sought his entire life." The evening concluded with champagne toasts, sparkling cider for Elena. But the words spoken celebrated not just the Innovation Center, but the philosophy it represented. That business could be profitable and ethical, that success didn't require sacrificing values, but that leadership was measured not by quarterly earnings, but by lasting impact. Later, as Elena and Thomas drove home to the house they'd designed together, solar-powered, built with sustainable materials but warm and welcoming rather than austere, Elena's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on the Innovation Center, you've done well. R. Robert." After 5 years of silence, but he'd reached out, though whether for closure or connection wasn't clear. Thomas glanced at the phone, but his expression was neutral. "Are you going to respond?" he asked. "But I'll support whatever you decide." Elena looked at the message, but she thought about the man who'd served her divorce papers, in the building she owned, the husband who'd underestimated her so completely that his arrogance became her liberation, but also the human being who'd spent 5 years living with consequences that had clearly taught him nothing about humility. She deleted the message without responding, but she felt no satisfaction in the act. No anger, just a quiet certainty that some chapters deserve to end without epilogues, that some people deserve to remain in the past where their choices had left them. No response needed, Elena said, setting the phone aside. He had 12 years to appreciate me, but he chose not to. I'm not giving him another second of my attention. Thomas reached for her hand, but his touch was warm, grounding. You know what I love most about you? He asked. But it's not your intelligence or your success or even your beauty, though you're stunning. It's that you've learned to value yourself the way others value you, but you no longer need external validation to know your worth. I learned that from you, Elena said, but also from Catherine, from Margaret, from every person who stood by me when I had nothing but potential and determination. You learned it from yourself, Thomas corrected, but we just reflected back what was always there. You just needed to see it. They arrived home to find the house lit from within, but the warmth of it represented everything Elena had built in 5 years. Not just professional success, but personal peace. Not just financial security, but emotional freedom. Not just a company, but a life, full and rich and entirely her own. That night, as Elena prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror, but the woman looking back bore little resemblance to the broken, devastated person who'd stood in a cafe 5 years ago, divorce papers on the table, world shattered. This woman was confident, powerful, 7 months pregnant with a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother's strength, but also knowing that strength could coexist with kindness, that power could be wielded with compassion. Thomas appeared behind her, but his arms circled her carefully, his hands resting on her belly where their daughter kicked with increasing frequency. What are you thinking? He asked, but I can see the wheels turning. I'm thinking that Robert did me the greatest favor of my life when he kicked me out after serving those divorce papers, Elena said, but not because I wanted revenge or because crushing him felt good. It didn't particularly. I'm grateful because his betrayal forced me to become someone I never would have chosen to be if comfortable, but someone I'm proud to be now that I've arrived. Your father knew, Thomas said, but he couldn't tell you because you had to discover it yourself. He gave you the tools, the company, the board, the trust, but you had to choose to use them, and you had to learn that using power responsibly is harder than having power unused. Elena turned in his arms, but her eyes met his with the kind of honesty that had built their marriage. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Robert had stayed loyal? If I'd never learned about the company, if I'd just remained the quiet wife supporting someone else's dreams? Never, Thomas said firmly, but not because I'm glad he hurt you. I'd take that pain away if I could. I don't wonder because I know you would have found your way eventually. But the circumstances just accelerated what was always going to happen. You were never meant to be someone's shadow, but you were meant to be exactly who you are. Elena Morrison Drake, CEO, philanthropist, architect of change, but most importantly, a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to settle for less. As they lay in bed, Elena's hand rested on her belly, but she thought about the story she'd tell her daughter someday. Not about revenge or betrayal, but about resilience, about discovering that you're stronger than you knew, about learning that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you create. 5 years ago, she'd been unaware she owned the $8.9 billion skyscraper company her husband worked in, but that ignorance had protected her from his ambition while revealing his character. He'd kicked her out after serving divorce papers to marry his secretary, but in doing so, he'd freed her from a prison she didn't know she was in, released her to become someone whose power came not from inheritance, but from choice, not from birthright but from hard-won wisdom. What she'd done had crushed his mistress and left him jobless, but it had also taught her that justice and revenge were different things, that standing up for yourself didn't require destroying others, just refusing to protect them from consequences they'd earned. But that forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation wasn't. The story could have been about revenge, but it became about redemption, not his but hers, not recovering what was lost, but discovering what was possible, but building something better from the ruins of something broken. Sterling Drake Development Corporation was worth $18.7 billion now, but Elena's net worth was irrelevant compared to the wealth she'd accumulated in relationships, in purpose, in the knowledge that she'd taken her father's legacy and honored it, not by preservation but by evolution, not by maintaining what was but by creating what could be. Robert Morrison lived in Spokane with adequate comfort and profound regret, but he'd learned nothing except that Elena had been more valuable than he'd realized, still seeing her as an asset rather than a person, still measuring worth in utility rather than humanity. Jessica Chen managed apartments in Portland with competence and humility, but she'd learned that shortcuts never lead where you think they will, that borrowed power is still borrowed, that genuine success requires genuine effort, but she'd learned too late to avoid the consequences that had reshaped her life. But Elena Morrison Drake stood in the house she'd designed with the man she loved, pregnant with the daughter who would inherit not just wealth but wisdom, not just power but principle, not just success but the understanding that how you achieve matters more than what you achieve, but that who you become in the process is the only legacy worth leaving. The lights of Seattle glowed through the bedroom window, but Sterling Heights Tower stood among them, its lights spelling out Sterling Drake in letters visible for miles. The building represented her past, but the Innovation Center represented her future, and the woman lying in bed represented the present, fully herself, fully alive, fully aware of her power, but also fully committed to using it wisely. 5 years ago, betrayal had destroyed her world, but from that destruction she'd built something better, not despite the pain but because of it, not around the wound but through it, transforming suffering into strength, humiliation into dignity, loss into gain measured not in dollars but in character, not in revenge but in resilience, not in what she'd taken from those who betrayed her, but in what she'd given to those who believed in her. And as sleep claimed her, Elena's last thought was simple but profound. Robert thought he was discarding trash when he kicked her out, but he'd actually been releasing a caged eagle who'd forgotten she had wings. And now that she remembered, now that she'd learned to fly, nothing would ever cage her again. The epilogue of her story wasn't an ending but a beginning, not a conclusion but a continuation, not the final chapter but the opening pages of everything that came next, and it was entirely, beautifully, powerfully hers.